This is the Whimsy Farm Podcast. I'm Carolyn Crane.
There's a big wide world right out your door. Good people doing good things. Whoa, it's a big wide world. Now is the time. Now is our time.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 19 of the podcast. Today I speak with Keith Runyan, activist, speaker, and new father. With a background as an educator, Keith began his Quaker activist career with the 12-day hunger strike to increase awareness of the importance of climate action to the Friends community and the general public. In 2024, along with his partner and child, he began a traveling ministry inspiring action on the planetary crisis. Keith is the General Secretary at Quaker Earthcare Witness, where he's leading the Quaker Earth Campaign to unite global earthcare action. Welcome to the Whimsy Farm Podcast, Keith Runyan.
It's great to be with you.
So we want to talk about the organization, Quaker Earthcare Witness. And I want to say that I love that name because it's so packed with action, caring and witnessing. So that name really is auspicious, I think. Can you talk a little bit about what Quaker Earthcare Witness is and does?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll just say, I don't know if everyone knows the history of the word witness, but for folks who are kind of outside the Christian circles, the word witness really doesn't refer to its modern sense of the word just to perceive something, but it's sort of how your perception of a divine reality, in this case, the Quaker roots of Quakerism are this idea of that of God in everyone, and are all of us having direct access to the inner light or to the divine, and how that relationship, how that connection to conscience, that connection to love, to spirit, immediately transitions out to outward action in the world, where by the movements of the spirit, one must act, one must show up and make those that witness visible. And so I think many of us have experienced that. And Quaker Earthcare Witness is this wonderful organization started in the 1980s that started on a profound concern for the state of the environment, for the litany of environmental issues that kind of grew out in the popular consciousness from the 1960s through 70s. And Quakers just decided, historically they're a peace church. Quakers have a long history of social justice action, et cetera, but that central need to be not just a religion that takes the lead on those issues, but one that sees, that names earth care, that names that deep interrelationship and unity with nature as the heart, as part of the heart of Quaker spirituality. That was really a centerpiece of what Quaker Earthcare Witness was founded to advocate for, as well as the realization of that in the way that we take action in the world. And so QEW today has evolved quite a bit from the QEW of the 80s and 90s, and is now an organization that really takes on three different domains of work. One, we run campaigns. This past year, we worked on the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest climate bill in history, not just US history, but actually world history due to the size of our economy, that the Biden administration passed in 2022, trying to protect this monumental law to transition the US economy from fossil fuels towards a more renewable economy. And we really were doing defensive work throughout this year. And obviously the big, beautiful bill did pass. I don't know if we should call it that, but we worked really hard with our partners to try to protect particular provisions in that bill, and we did not lose on every front. And I can go in more on that at some level, but a lot of the worst ideas were pushed back, and we now have some of the provisions of that law remain until 2027. So that I can talk more about that work. But that's, we do campaigning work, both advocacy, phone calls to legislators, et cetera, lobby visits, and like on the street activism. So kind of both of those things in our campaigns, supporting Quakers across the country. On that, we do local action. So we have a mini grants program to support climate justice work the world over, especially in Quaker communities. So supporting cloud forest regeneration in Veracruz, Mexico, to working with a climate radio station right now in Kenya to educate people on climate issues. So we're doing a lot of work there. And then finally, QEW is the largest network of Quaker environmentalists worldwide. And we operate to try to bring together friends on those concerns. And so we're doing a global map of Quaker environmental action and do a lot to try to build the capacity of friends to respond to a moment that, from our perspective, is existential, that where we need to be rising to meet this challenge in a way that is as bold as our times are urgent. And I think that has grown to be really a central piece of QEW, that it wants to be an organization that that responds courageously to the time that we're living in, and doesn't fiddle around the edges, but really shows up in a way that will actually, strikes a bead of hope or lights a beacon in this time.
I saw that when looking through the website. There's grit there. There's your sleeves are rolled up and you have your work boots on. That's very clear. And so let's talk about the legislative, the big bill, whatever. I can't say it, but you did.
Inflation reduction. Yeah.
Let's talk about that aspect of your work and what gains you've made and what you managed to save in this new administration.
Yeah, so our major push following Trump's reelection, we felt this profound need to say, like, where can we make a difference? As I'm sure many of the listeners here do, there's this sense in November of like, okay, maybe we saw a little bit of this coming, but like now it's clear what reality we're stepping into. And so QEW was working with Friends Committee on National Legislation, which is the Quaker lobby in Washington, to decide on what can we do to protect the earth, protect people and planet at this time, and protect the gains that we've made on climate policy, et cetera. And for listeners who are not as familiar, the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, I think it's funny it was named that. It's named that for political reasons, but it's really a climate bill. But had ways and affected the whole economy and thus inflation. The basic architecture of that bill was to provide massive tax credits across the U.S. economy for moving to clean energy sources. There's some debate, this had to be worked through with Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. So what defined a clean energy source got a little bit broader than I think many of us here would want it to be. But the end result of it was a bill that was, by the best expert analysis, would be keeping a gigaton of carbon dioxide a year out of the atmosphere by 2035. At the 2025 mark, we were in the 200, 300 megatons of carbon dioxide a year kind of range, and that would build as the maturation of that effect on the economy occurred in the 2030s. And to put that in perspective, the best scientific evidence suggests that for every 1,000 tons of CO2 in the atmosphere, that's the really rough estimate for about 1,000 tons is a single human mortality, not to mention massive impacts across the earth. And then you do that math, what we're talking about is about 1 million people per year saved over the course of the century, with a gigaton of carbon dioxide being removed. So that is, an incredible shift in the trajectory that we're on, a huge chunk out of that 2.8 degrees Celsius temperature rise, 2.5, whatever it is. And so, that was a big, what we managed to save, a lot of it got gutted. All of these tax credits got chopped, right, by this bill. But there was a coalition of about 20 plus Republicans in the House and the Senate who, because the benefits of the clean energy transition were massively slated towards rural Republican districts. They actually designed the law such that the people who got the best tax credits were people who used to run coal-fired power plants or other things like that. So it was saying, like, coal workers, how do you transition them into a new economy? You give massive incentives for companies to build new renewable infrastructure in old coal country. And that meant that 80% of the benefits, of the economic benefits of the bill, were channeled towards Republican districts. So if you want to, Republicans are not usually one to stake their claims on trying to defend the environment on various issues. But if you, when it comes to people's livelihoods, people's jobs, et cetera, in a rural district, a moderate, huge coalition of moderate Republicans really actually were fighting behind the scenes to try to keep this from the worst versions of this bill from being passed, and actually trying to protect most of that 2022 law. Unfortunately, as everyone probably witnessed, the power of the presidency to, the amount of, just top-down pressure from the presidency and Republicans just cowing to that pressure was immense. And so only one senator, Tom Tillis of North Carolina, who had been standing up on this issue the whole time, ended up staking his career on not passing that bill. And he actually gave a whole Senate speech and talking about the negative impacts of the big beautiful bill, specifically on climate and specifically on the energy transition. And then he said, "I'm done with politics." So one senator, but behind the scenes, there were attempts to cut some of the biggest tax credits this year, or sometimes like within 30 days. And those all got, removed, or the biggest ones got removed. And so the biggest tax credits in that bill to protect this transition towards renewable energy, and you can think about, like, for listeners, these are tax credits like if you've put solar on your house in the last couple of years and the government offered you an $8,000 rebate. That's the kind of tax credits we're talking about, these incentives to move towards a renewable energy system. So anyways, by 2020, many of those tax credits, especially the industry ones, which are actually the biggest impact ones total, but also kind of the least, like, as a person who really believes in rooftop solar and less giant solar fields and stuff like that, but the industry ones got saved by 2027. So there was a lot of effort there to try to protect those, and they were not fully brought to the chopping block. There was some behind the scenes pushback that we really, were campaigning and in senators' offices day in, day out to try to ensure that maintained.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Yeah. And I don't think many people knew that was happening, that those nuances don't make the headlines of mainstream media, and they could make a big difference in what I want to say. They could make a big difference in when we come out of this and we start restoring what we've lost, that we will have much more to work with because of the behind the scenes work that you're describing. So I'm glad to know about that. But So that's one is the legislative, and then two is the educational outreach.
Yeah, or the educational, I would say it's the network empowerment work is how we're kind of referring to it these days. I think we used to refer to it as educational outreach, so that's a significant part of what we're doing. You know, network empowerment, we publish a quarterly periodical called Befriending Creation, which really talks about the whole spectrum of earth care related issues. From we've been talking a lot about climate, but obviously that's just one small piece of the puzzle that we're all working with. And so really highlighting the environmental efforts of friends and bringing together Quaker voices on environmental issues. And we also run a monthly events program. If friends here want to attend a QEW event, you can go to QuakerEarthcare.org/events. And but we bring together speakers to talk about these issues, largely either from the Quaker space or from a closely connected sphere. And we also publish position papers. You know, we do advocacy with the United Nations, and we're often, you know, just we were talking about this earlier with COP30, but you know, I was just giving talks in the last month to kind of update the Quaker world on the outcomes of COP30 and what it means for our future. It's this kind of, you know, we bring together friends to work on these issues. We have a 50-person steering committee that takes representatives from every Quaker yearly meeting, which is like a large you know grouping of Quaker churches that these different regions all send representatives to QEW. And it's this space where we really come together to develop a Quaker voice on the environment. And that's pretty open to individuals coming in. So that that's, you know, I think by and large, the educational work we're doing is that kind of outreach, position papers, kind of the quarterly periodical and events. And then kind of going into network empowerment more broadly, we're doing this really strong effort this year to try to build the first ever map, network, and database of Quaker environmental action worldwide. And so we have a full-time Quaker Voluntary Service Fellow who is calling up Quaker meetings and mapping out the full spectrum of environmental action in hopes of really uniting and doing this sort of base building effort for not just QEW's own campaigning and but also just like creating synergies between, you know, you're doing permaculture in this area, you can connect with this other group that's doing this thing that you didn't know there was any other Quakers doing. And so trying to build those, the potential for those connections to occur is something we're really hoping can have a broader network effect on Quaker environmentalism. I would
And
say
on furthering your mission. Yes, I think that's huge, because I think that those of us who are think of stewarding land rather than colonizing land often feel alone.
yeah, yeah,
So to know there's someone down the road or across town that can someone we can network with that can keep somebody from giving up.
yeah, yeah. And that's what we're hoping that creates. And there's space for not just meetings, Quaker churches and meetings, but also individual stories that friends can add their own stories up into this map. And the map is designed to help connect people who are working on similar things. So a lot of different pieces there, but it's I think it's a really exciting tool for bringing people together.
So let's talk about COP30 and your experience and how you feel it went and what you accomplished for QEW.
Yeah. So I went, so for folks who may be a little less familiar, the COP30 is the United Nations Climate Convention that happens every year as part of the international treaties that we've, almost every country on Earth is signed on to. Pete, friends have probably heard of the Paris Agreement. the Kyoto Protocol, and the broader treaty that's all situated in is called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. So ever since the 90s and the Rio Earth Summit, which also happened in Brazil, there's been the world has been working both in these issues as well as desertification issues, as well as biodiversity issues, which, by the way, QEW is involved in all three of those branches of the United Nations. But there is one specific branch that's focusing particularly on climate change, and that's the UNFCCC. So the COPs, the Conference of the Parties, have been happening ever since the 90s, and they're what resulted in the Kyoto Protocol. They're what resulted in the Paris Agreement, and we just had this big COP30 in Belém, Brazil, in the heart of the Amazon. Yeah, I think one thing I want to really bring into focus there, because I think it hasn't disseminated around activist circles, I think, quite enough, because there's so much doom in the air, so much doom, so much a sense of like, we don't make progress ever at all, right? And the truth is slightly more complicated. We were on track for 4 degrees Celsius of temperature rise, according to the best scientific estimates. We could talk about best scientific estimates at another point, but that was what we were on track for, according to the UN at that time, the UN Environmental Agency at that moment. And what we're on track for now is about 2.8. So we've actually dropped a degree 0.2 in the estimate in just the last 10 years, which is in some ways remarkable progress. It's not nearly enough is the problem, right? But I think there's a decent number of activists who I've told that, and they're like, oh, really? Like, we're tilting this curve. And the truth is that we are. And I think some of that just has to do with the price of solar panels going down. But another huge part of it has to do, and I think all the major experts would say this, is that the process that is happening at these COPs, as problematic as they are, and they are problematic, has produced international pressure and effort that has resulted in a dampening of the curve of that we're on. And so, the question is, how do we actually get to the place where we need to go? Because obviously we know that the goals that we supposedly are aiming towards are like 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise or 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise. And we're way off track for those. It's the cold, hard facts of the matter. And so QEW shows up to these, has been present and worked with our partners at these events since the 90s. And we largely participate with our Quaker allies, Quakers in Britain, Quaker United Nations office, but also with the broader interfaith community. There's something called the Interfaith Liaison Committee that is deeply involved in these negotiations, hosts a number of different side events and press conferences, and works to educate negotiators and take a broad faith stance on climate change that's able to push us in the direction of justice. And I would say that my number one thing that I would say I just adore about being involved in this process is working with this interfaith community. I mean, these are people who I find to be some of the most ethically committed people I've ever met, some of the most sincere, you were just talking about, anti-colonial, very, very like justice-centric, uplifting of indigenous wisdom and indigenous knowledge. Like you might not have ever been in a room with, a member of, where Islamic Relief, Christian Aid, Quakers, all of these different groups from disparate faith traditions are all speaking the same language about that. But that's the reality of what exists in that group and that leadership. And so it's really exciting to be a part of that and to kind of make that voice heard in these negotiations, and two countries, some of which are very faith-based, right? for whom I think that voice needs to be very clear. And so we published positions with that group, and I did a side event, so I was a speaker at one of these events. You can probably find it on the QEW YouTube page if you go searching. It was really inspiring. I think the voice that I was trying to bring was really focused on the crisis that we're in the United States as an example of how we find the light in the dark, and that what's happening here is just a echo of what's happened many times in history, and that we have many examples throughout history of how we can show up in deep courage and in deep faith in the face of that, and that setting that example in the United States, that the example of resistance, that example of deep love and deep conviction, deep commitment. We're not the only country in the world facing the rise of right-wing populism, fascistic echoes, and we have a responsibility with how center of the limelight we are to show that resistance is possible. So that was really a huge central point of my own ministry at COP30. But obviously, the overall outcomes were mixed. It's in some ways, the activist part of me would say it was a failure, because in many aspects it was. The fossil fuels was completely not mentioned 2 years ago. It was. There was so much pushback, but I think that what people need to see in that is that the international situation has really devolved in a lot of ways in the last 2 years. There's a real breakdown of trust, a real breakdown of, at some level, leadership. Like, at least the U.S. was like signaling that the richer countries of the world think that it's some level their responsibility to try to do something about a problem that will hit the poorest countries first and worst, right? That had nothing to do with causing the problem in the first place. With the U.S. leaving that, it leaves people in this dog eat dog, you just got to get by yourself. And sometimes fossil fuels can provide a short-term solution to, a problem that unfortunately has massive negative repercussions in the long term. So a lot of countries are trying to decide on that, but there was real leadership from groups like Colombia, from the group of small island developing countries that face sea level rise in ways that, they're just, to them, it's just survival. But, I was really impressed with a few countries like Colombia. They're hosting a fossil fuel non-proliferation conference in March. And even though there wasn't progress on a number of the things that we'd like to see, I think that there's a number of countries that have absolutely not given up. And I think it's there that we need to be putting our energy and our focus. How do we continue to create those wins and light our candles in the dark.
So when you were immersed in this international activist culture, how do they see us as the people of the United States of America? And how has that changed with this new regime?
Well, there was a one activist protest that was happening in the middle of the COP every day, and they were calling out different countries that were falling behind on their commitments. And they have a giant dinosaur costume, and they just be talking about the fossil of the day, right, for fossil fuels, right? I was there when they had the conversation about the United States, and I don't think it can be overstated that the U.S., pretty much, actually, I would say, is just the largest climate pariah on Earth at this point. Like Saudi Arabia, some of these like Gulf petrostates are really bad, but they have not exited the agreements, and they do not have the powers that Trump is wielding with tariffs to undermine every single effort internationally made to which is not saying, he hasn't, the main thing that he's done right before this conference, there was a meeting of the International Maritime Organization that was trying to set a carbon tax on shipping. And the US did not show up to the UN climate negotiations, but did show up to this maritime conference. And for the first time ever, as I understand it, this has never happened before. They started openly threatening countries with tariffs and sanctions in the midst of the negotiations in front of everybody if they were to, sign on to supporting that treaty. So like the level of bullying that's happening is just not something any other country is capable of. But also, I would just say that we are really, the current administration is moving in every single way in the wrong direction on this. And it's perceived that way. And there's a deep breakdown of trust. I don't think what's maybe the saddest and most difficult side of this is I don't think the US will ever, at this point, it'll take decades before the rest of the world will ever trust the US again, regardless of if we change our president in 2028. Right? Because at some level, there's this feeling that we never know if another Donald Trump gets elected, right? Like clearly that's possible here. It wasn't just a fluke. It didn't just happen in 2016, right? Clearly, we just have to think that that's always a possibility and plan for it accordingly, right? And so that's a really deep wound. But I think that there's also, when I was talking to individual activists, the number of people who were just overjoyed that I was there, coming from the United States to like advocate and speak on the behalf of climate action and talk about resistance and talk about like that. There was just so much celebration, I think, of bringing people in, so much condemnation of the people who were not showing up, but celebration of people who were continuing to try to make that difference. It's one of those things that requires a sober assessment, a sober look at the realities, but also Brazil faced Bolsonaro, just prior to electing Lula. And the AfD is on the rise in Germany. And, all of these different places, they're facing their own version of this. And so they need to know that folks, everyday folks like the people listening here, aren't giving up, but are showing up each day with that kind of courage and conviction.
And how do we? I've been noticing what a happy countenance that you have, and how often and with such joy you smile and laugh. And yet you say it'll take decades, which do we have decades? So, how do we avoid being pessimistic, and what's the best thing we can do as individual Americans to keep moving forward and be the best stewards we could be?
I think that's such a good question. And to me, I think the question I'd want to ask the audience, everyone can do their own check here, is to you, is hope something that's internal or external? Is it something you hold as a way of relating to the world? Or is it something that you look for from the world? And I think, maybe there's some degree to which both of those things will be true in our lives. Like, I'm reminded by Robin Wall Kimmerer saying, that this notion that the earth loves you, in return, it's not just you love the earth. And I think there is maybe a broad view of history that I have that that the cycles of rivalry, of competition, of hubris, of lack of wisdom, etc., frankly, often can win in the short term. I think they do win often in the short term. Like, there's ways that if you have no moral scruples, you can outcompete people who do. Like all sorts of ways you can do that. And frankly, I think that's been happening historically at a civilizational level. That's been happening. The people who have been least oriented towards domination and violence, et cetera, have been moved to the margins of history. And the cultures that are most centric on domination, acceleration of power, acceleration of scientific progress, which I think is great fundamentally, but can lead to this massive expansion of human power where wisdom is not equivalent to the powers that we're wielding. And I think that I think we're at the sort of endpoint at some level of that story. I think that those things don't survive long term. I think that rivalry, competition, war, lack of wisdom carries the seeds of its own destruction. And the problem is that, it can take a lot of beautiful things with it. I think that's where we need to do our grief work, is that a lot of beautiful things can be lost in those cycles. But where we need to find that internal hope, that like kind of indomitable sense within ourselves, is we need to decide what side of history we want to be on. And we need to decide internally, what matters to you beyond the scope of your own life. Like, what are you devoted to that was there long before you were born and goes on after you, long after you're gone? And to me, there's this old story that I'm sure many listeners might be familiar with, of the child and the seashells, or the sea stars walking on the seashore. And there's this huge typhoon that brings all these stars in, and they're all dying on the beach because they're being exposed to the sun. And the cynical older man sees this child tossing the stars back into the ocean and says, what's the point? There's tens of thousands. You're throwing one in at a time. You're never gonna do this, right? And it doesn't matter. What you're doing does not matter, right? And child looks up and tosses another one in and says, well, it mattered to that one, and it mattered to this one, and it mattered to this one. And so recognizing internally that even the smallest things are worth it, I think, is a deeply moral and courageous stance that each of us needs to take internally. And then I want to prod folks also to say, a little bit of moral ambition in this time is maybe also worthwhile to have. That if you have the privilege and capacity for it, the willingness to not just do the kind of easy stuff in front of you, but to really say, clearly we're on a path that any person of conscience, any person of deep heart or soul, would find to be unconscionable. What can I do to not just kind of work around the edges of that, but to go to the heart of it and try to really make a difference? And I won't be, there's grief work, and I won't be able to save everything. It's not like we're going to just end up in paradise in 2060, as much as that would be great. But I think that we can have far too certain views of the future. I think that reality always humbles our best projections of it. And so working towards that more beautiful future will always be the choice, the moral choice, the conscientious choice. So I would just encourage people to do that every day, and to ask, what am I led to do? And not be afraid if that thing that is deeply in your soul about what needs to be done, even if it's big, walk in that direction.
Well, I love the things you just said. It made me think of a couple things I want to introduce in the conversation. You started by talking about hope. And I thought that a corollary to that with the word love as a verb, as things that we do, versus seeking love for ourselves, like as out extrinsic, intrinsic. And I also, there was a woman we had on last season, Rachel Tiferet. She's a activist in Massachusetts for the Palestinian cause. And I asked her about hope and the bleakness of the genocide there. And she said, hope doesn't have a lot to do with it. This is the right thing to do.
As was said, there's this beautiful quote by a mystic that Eddie Hillesum, who was a Jew in Germany during the Holocaust, died in the Holocaust, died at Auschwitz. And during the entire time she was in the concentration camps before Auschwitz, kept a journal that was published, and in that journal, one of the things she wrote was, which is so beautiful. I just recommend look up Eddie Hillesum and look up this, her writings. But she said that it all comes down to this, that I believe in love. And she said this about like looking at her prison guards. This is the context. She was talking about the prison guards. She was in the concentration camp. It all comes down to this, that I believe in love. And I want to be able to look into the depths of what others would call horror and still say that life is beautiful.
I think that's what we need to keep inside of ourselves, because we must move forward with joy and heart. That's what's contagious. That's what brings people to want to join us, not bleakness and despair and hopelessness. And I see that in you, and it gives me hope. And I wanted to, as we close, I wanted to get a little more personal and talk about what keeps Keith Runyan going through this. There are no blinders on. You see what we're up against, and you've dedicated your career now to making change as much as possible. What keeps you hopeful and loving?
Maybe it's moments in my life where things became very clear. I think we all have these where, there's something that you perceive these kind of moments of deep clarity that is so affecting to you that you decide that you want to live by that for the rest of your days. And to me, I had an experience, and many experiences since, but really a life-transforming experience in 2011 in Richmond, Indiana, at the Quaker Meeting House there, where I don't know, it shifted in my consciousness, but there was just this profound sense that moved through me that was so deep that I don't think I could have explained it to myself beforehand, but that everything, that reality itself was fundamentally beautiful. And that my life wasn't my own. It was one ripple in a larger ocean. And that I just wanted to do everything I could to be in service to that beauty. And I think ever since then, it's obviously it's not just the moments, it's what keeps you going. But I think everybody faces their own demons. And, I think that the last year I've noticed moments where maybe a little bit of despair, but certainly also a sense of just where I noticed that my orientation, I think I'm a pretty forgiving person kind of in my innate orientation towards the world and towards other people. I have a lot of right-wing uncles and I'm still in conversation with some of them, all of them actually. But I've noticed seeing what's happening, this part of me that wants to, where derision sort of, this extreme kind of anger to the point of just like, you're not even worth my time kind of feeling can show up. And how could you be so hypocritical? all of these different voices, and um and that towards people I know, but also to, the whole thing. Right. And I think that I try to show up to those things and remind myself who I want to be, you know and remind myself that, whenever I think it's really important for us to reflect on these moments that we've been with our family or other people in our life. Like, what attitudes that you've embodied have led towards healing and positive emotion in the relationships you inhabit, and what orientations and attitudes have fed the monster. And I think, as above, so below. There's, those things that are true at that very micro level can be true on the macro level. And I think there's a need for deep truth telling. Like, I do believe that joy and um, hope, those things, there's something really important about those in the way that we show up, that we need to be. But I think what maybe is the most important piece of it is aliveness. I think being real about, like, how much pain you're in or how much anger you have, as long as you're able to root it in that deeper life and then connect it to that, realize that the reason you're angry, the reason why you're numbing down, the reason why you're cutting yourself off from things, the reason why, you feel despair is because you love the world so much, right? You wouldn't feel angry if you didn't give a darn. And you wouldn't try to numb if it wasn't too painful to look at. And so when we are able to face that numbness, that anger, that pain, and see the love beneath it, and have both of those things show up in the way that we speak truth to power, the way we speak truth to one another, I think it's something about that, and maybe a little dose of humility, that changes the world.
Thank you for that wisdom. I feel that you are definitely on the right track there. A couple more questions before I let you go. 2026, Quaker Earthcare Witness, what is your organization's, what's on the top of your list?
So this is really exciting. When I started in 2023, we were a two-staff organization with $200,000 budget, or less than 200, about $180,000 budget. And we are now a four-staff organization with a $360,000 budget 2 years later. And one of the things, we just got a 2-year grant for about $92,000 from the Shoemaker Fund to begin launching this set of trainings around nonviolent activism and strategy, with Quaker meetings in New York, Philadelphia, Minneapolis, and California, and soon to be elsewhere. But those are our initial focus points. And really, this kind of nonviolent activism rooted in this deep spirituality, and a continued expansion of our network and mapping work. So that is, running these trainings and launching this large scale series of cohorts across the country to begin really training activists to take on the powers that be in this moment is a big piece of what we'll be doing in 2026. And then we're doing a lot of deep strategy work about campaign efforts, but I think there's a very good chance that we'll be working on the Make Polluters Pay bills that have popped up in California and New Jersey and a number of other states across the country, to mobilize Quakers and others. If you're non-Quaker and you kind of vibe with Quakers, you can totally show up and join us for these things, and show up for the Q. Go to QuakerEarthCare.org and you can sign up for our newsletter.
As someone who's vibed with Quakers for decades, I can attest that it's a very welcoming group.
Yeah, and nobody's gonna tell you don't belong here. That's not gonna. I don't think that will happen. Anyway, but you're folks are more than welcome to join for that. And I think I'll just say this as a seed, because it's too early for me to put this out on a podcast. But I think there's a real sense in our organization that we need to not just be doing these legislator calls, et cetera, but really put our bodies on the line and make a really powerful witness that can really step into the realm of courage in the way that we try to to spark the kind of change we think is needed in the world. And so we're in discernment about how to make that a lived reality.
We will look and see where you go with that. That sounds exciting. And last question that I always ask is, and I say thank you for giving us your time today. And is there anything that you didn't get to say that you'd like to say now?
I just want to express gratitude to you, Carolyn, for this amazing opportunity and for the Whimsy Farm podcast. I was listening to a few episodes before this, and you're doing great work. And yeah, to anyone in the audience who's feeling a sense of calling or need or concern on this work, please do reach out. My email is keith@QuakerEarthCare.org, and I consider it my ministry and calling in this world to be trying to uplift and bring people into a deeper relationship with their callings and with regards to all of this. And I'd be more than happy to show up in compassion and listening in those conversations.
Keith Runyan from Quaker Earthcare Witness, thanks so much for joining us today on the Whimsy Farm podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone.
I've been speaking with Keith Runyan, climate activist and General Secretary of Quaker Earthcare Witness. You can reach Keith through the website QuakerEarthCare.org. This podcast is produced on the sacred ancestral land of the Anishinaabe people. Thanks to the California band Castle House for writing and performing our music. The Whimsy Farm podcast airs the 1st and 15th of each month on our YouTube channel, Carolyn Crane and Whimsy Farm, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Thanks to our underwriter, Just Play Production, and to our paid Patreon members for their support of today's podcast. If you'd like to offer your support, please visit my website, whimsyfarm.net, and click the Patreon link to find a level of support that's right for you. There's also a free membership level. You can email me through the website, as well as access all links to past and current episodes. That's whimsyfarm.net. Be sure to tune in on February 1st when we welcome author Carol Menaker and discuss her memoir, The Worst Thing We've Ever Done, One Juror's Reckoning with Racial Injustice. Her book explores the trial and unjust incarceration of Freddie Muhammad Burton, imprisoned for 50 years now in Pennsylvania for crimes he did not commit. Until then, remember the words of Utah Phillips, who said, "Too many good people are doing too many good things to afford me the luxury of being pessimistic." Get out there and create some positive change. Stay safe, everyone.
whimsyfarms.net